Well, the images that we are seeing coming out of Kramatorsk are unnerving, to say the least. I'm not going to ascribe blame to either party in the war. The way that things get, once you get into a war, people start dying. We're over a month into this at this point. In the age of modern warfare where you have big guns and big bombs that make big explosions, you can't limit the casualties to just folks in the military, even if the intention of both sides is to do just that. And so sadly, events like this are to be expected. They're inevitable. But as of right now, we don't know who's directly responsible. And that's not stopping the media in the West from using this event, this very sad event, to, I'm trying to be careful with my words here, but essentially propagandize against Russia. We're being told one side of this, which is the Ukrainians, and of course they come up with the most cartoonish characterization possible. I have no reason to think that that the Russians didn't do this or aren't responsible for it. They could be. I also have no reason to believe that the Ukrainians aren't responsible for it. And when the Ukrainians are making just a cartoonish case as to why this is Russia's fault, I have reason to doubt them and to not believe them. If the case that they were making sounded reasonable, I wouldn't have trouble believing it. But when they want to make it out like the Ruskies are just these demonic mongrels who thirst for the blood of civilians, and that, no, it's not like, the Russians were bombing this area and they happened to hit this train station that had a bunch of civilians. It was, no, the Russians specifically targeted this area because it had so many civilians and because they want to commit genocide against our population, and they want to eradicate us from the earth, and this is just like the Holocaust, and Putin is Hitler, and all of this stuff. While at the same time, back in the day when I remember an instance, I believe it was under Obama or maybe very, very early on in the Trump administration, the United States blew up a Doctors Without Borders hospital in Iraq. I mean, you don't get much more, or was it Afghanistan? I think it was northern Iraq. You don't get much more, innocent civilian than that. And no one in the Western media jumped to the conclusion, look, the U.S. did this to intimidate the local population, to show, hey, even after you're wounded, there is no mercy, and, blah, blah, blah. Barack Obama or Donald Trump is Hitler because of this strike. There was none of that. And so here we have a very similar situation. And there's actually two air forces involved. It's not like in, Iraq or Afghanistan, where we knew the only air force, the only people dropping bombs out of the skies was the United States. Here in Ukraine, you have both Ukraine and Russia. And so, the only thing that you can really, I guess, rule out, reasonably, although you can't rule it out based on evidence because we don't have evidence. But logically, the only explanation out of the possible ones that doesn't make sense is that the Ukrainians intentionally bombed their own people. Now, you could make the case that the Ukrainians are so desperate and so cynical that they're willing to, massacre their own people in order to gain sympathy from the West to try and spur Western intervention. Because we have seen that in wars recently, like in Syria. But you don't have to believe that the Ukrainians, are just that cynical and that bad. You could also think that this was an accident, that it was an accident, it was an accident committed by either side. Because, like I said, Kramatorsk appears to be, the next big fight in this war after Mariupol. And so you have two armies clashing in this town, and it hasn't really begun in earnest yet, but it's getting there. And both sides probably want to try and solve. And I'm not a war reporter. I'm not on the ground there. I don't know what's going on. But I'm just saying, logically, when you think about a war, people, they shell or they bomb. The other side trying to soften them up before the battle. And so, you look at this situation and you say, does the Ukrainian explanation make sense? Does it make sense that the Russians would intentionally want to massacre, 30 Ukrainian civilians and injure 100 more, if you take the Ukrainian side of the story and their casualty numbers? Does that make sense? What do the Russians have to gain from that? I can't think of anything they have to gain. In fact, I would say, that's a great risk for Russians to do that, because they're almost inviting Western intervention then, and you can have Hillary Clinton come in and say, we have a responsibility to protect, we need a no-fly zone, this has to stop, close the skies. Because remember, the Bucha thing, that's tough, because those are soldiers on the ground that we're told, committed those great atrocities in Bucha, which is also unproven. Sorry, I had to say that a little bit under my breath. Because I don't want the YouTube censors to come after me. But now, and I'm sure in a day or two, questioning Kramatorsk will become, a bannable offense on YouTube. All the more reason, to follow me on BitChute and Rumble, where my name is the same. So you shouldn't have trouble finding me. But anyway, I don't want to get off on a tangent about censorship. But like I was saying, it doesn't make sense that the Russians would intentionally do something like this, because it does play perfectly into the Ukrainian narrative calling for a no-fly zone, which of course would mean World War III and total annihilation of the human race. That's what it would mean. It would mean direct conflict, direct war between the world's two greatest nuclear powers. And so the Russians understand that, and they're going to want to take precautions to avoid that. So it's not reasonable to me to just take their explanation at face value. And so if the Ukrainians are giving an unreasonable explanation about this situation, I am forced to consider alternatives. And the alternatives being either that, well, okay, if the Russians did it intentionally, maybe the Ukrainians did it intentionally, which is something that I also think is not super reasonable, but possible. It's possible. Perhaps, I don't even know if I would go so far as to call it plausible, because it is really just such a ghastly thing to do. But, you could say that it was, maybe it wasn't orchestrated from the top, but let's say maybe you could make the argument that there was some rogue pilot who was desperate and is just trying to, and wants to create his own false flag to spur Western intervention. After all, we just had the situation in Belgorod, I always say that city wrong, where the Russians, credited the Ukrainians with blowing up some oil storage depot, and the Ukrainian government says, we didn't do that. Which, there could be reasons why for the discrepancies there, but everyone pretty much agrees. That's not, Western media also picked up on that immediately, and credited the Ukrainians with that. What it might mean is that elements within the Ukrainian military are starting to act independently of central command in Kiev. But still, with that said, it is, I think, an extraordinary claim that soldiers within an army would massacre 30 of its own civilians, who they are sworn to protect, just to try and rope, it's sort of a last-ditch effort of trying to rope in foreign countries to intervene on their behalf. And so the most likely explanation is that either the Ukrainian or the Russian side, to me, did this by accident. Because this is in a war zone where bombs are flying in both directions. And so it could have been either one of them. And at this point, there's no evidence to me that suggests one party may be more likely to be guilty than the other. But nevertheless, that doesn't matter, because right now, the situation in Kramatorsk is being used by the Western media, as I said, to push for war. This is trying to enrage the Western public, particularly the American public, in order to build support for a no-fly zone, or maybe something else. Maybe, because they've gone quiet on the no-fly zone thing recently, but what else but a no-fly zone could they be considering? And as I said after the Bucha incident, I said we're going to see more things like Bucha. And that's what this is. It's not the identical situation, but it's similar from a media narrative perspective. And in this case, even if, let's say, the Ruskies were behind it, which is, there's no evidence of that, one way or the other. But let's just say that they were. And it was an accident. But the media portrayed this as just, the evil Russians going about and terrorizing people and massacring them for fun. And it was because of that, because, the American public viewed the Russians as these barbarians who were going around slaughtering people for no reason, that they then came to support what eventually would spiral into a Third World War. That would still be a lie on the part of the media, even if they weren't lying necessarily about, the Russians being, the ultimate perpetrators. The way that they mischaracterized the actions of the Russians. Again, in this hypothetical situation in which we've found out, I'm saying like 5 years down the road after the war, or maybe 5 years after the war started and the war is still going on, we find out the truth about, this incident or an incident like it. And we find out, okay, yeah, the Ruskies really did do that, like the media said, but it was a total accident. If the American people are sucked into this war on the pretext that it was, because in reaction to the Ruskies doing it intentionally, you'd call that a false flag. And so that's what I'm getting at. You can turn a real situation into a false flag by just spinning the narrative, no matter what the truth is. Deciding what you want it to be. Just like with, somebody brought up the example of, Saddam Hussein and weapons of mass destruction. It was already determined that the U.S. wanted to go to war with Saddam Hussein, and the weapons of mass destruction were the excuse for that. We all know that story. But from what I remember correctly, there was some kind of like chemical weapons depots or chemical weapons research facilities within Iraq. And they tried to take that as a victory and say, oh, well, look, Saddam Hussein had mustard gas, which anybody can make in their kitchen. But when the media, before the Iraq War, was talking about weapons of mass destruction, what they really were signaling to people was Saddam Hussein has nuclear weapons, there was never any indication of that. That was always 100% a lie. And so even if the U.S., claimed to have found chemical weapons labs, which in and of itself, I believe, is not even something that most people recognize, that I'd have to explore the claim more, but I think that even is not, accepted as fact. Well, let's say it were. I'm trying to be as generous as possible here. That would still be a false flag. The original false flags were massacres committed by, I believe, the British and then blamed on the French. And so when you say something's a false flag, that doesn't mean it didn't happen. Those ships that were raped and pillaged by the British and then blamed on the French, those ships were still raped and pillaged. Those people were murdered. Those women were raped. That wealth was stolen, by these pirates. But they weren't French pirates. They were British pirates. That's why it's called a false flag, because they raised the French flag, or it might have been the other way around, but I'm pretty sure it's the British that did this. They raised the French flag, and then they committed all these atrocities, and then they lowered the French flag and raised the Union Jack again and said, look, we're the heroes. And there have been all sorts of events like this throughout history. And why? Why is it that people in war, or people who want to get involved in wars, constantly turn to false flags and stage these sorts of events? Or, I shouldn't even say stage these events, because we don't have evidence of the spin these kinds of narratives. Because, listen, you can take a totally, real event that happened and then spin a fake narrative about it. That's a false flag. And so why do people use that tactic? Well, because it works. That's how the U.S. got into the Spanish-American War. That's how the U.S. got into World War I. That's arguably, well, actually, no. I would say at this point you could even call Pearl Harbor a false flag of a sort. Obviously, Pearl Harbor happened. But I think that, it's becoming more and more accepted that Pearl Harbor is something that happened because the United States, under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, let it happen. It was FDR and his administration that was trying to bait the Japanese into war. And so Pearl Harbor was not an unprovoked attack. It was Japan taking the bait. And so, when you look at it that way, Pearl Harbor becomes a false flag. It's something that really happened. It was an attack by the Japanese on the United States. But the details around it were manipulated and concealed by the media and the government in order to create a false reality. And so that's what we're going to see continually happen in Ukraine. Every time that there is any sort of atrocity against civilians, we are going to see the same script rolled out, whether it is accurate or not. And in some cases, it might be accurate, because what happens in wars? People become dehumanized. Soldiers commit atrocities. And so, perhaps already, but certainly not, if not already, the longer this war drags on, there will at some point, or perhaps at multiple points in the war, be examples of atrocities committed by the Russians against the Ukrainians. Real sick, satanic actions, because that happens in wars. It's part of the reason why I think wars are evil in general, and why they must be avoided at almost all costs. And so I hope that this doesn't work. It didn't work in Syria, thankfully. Not enough people cared. But this is obviously very, very different from the situation in Syria. People care much more about Ukraine than they ever did about Syria. The media just could not rile people up in this manner about the situation in Syria. And so I think our only hope is that at some point this will reach not a critical mass, but it will peak. And it will peak below critical mass, if that makes sense. We want that the public outrage over the war in Ukraine, we want it to peak at a level in which the situation is still stable here in the United States, and that we don't want it to peak in a zone in which people are ready. You know what? Let's just send in the tanks, or let's declare that no-fly zone, because then we're sucked into this. And whatever the trigger event eventually is, that may or may not bring us into this conflict. Almost certainly, if we look back at it 10, 20, 30, 80 years later, if the past is any indication, we will come to find out that we were lied to about those events, we were misled, and that the situation, had we known the truth at the time, would not have led us to make the decisions which ultimately would lead to a war between the world's two greatest nuclear powers. And I fear that we will start to see these sorts of events escalate. These stories, the narrative will escalate with each successive event until there is an intervention from the West, which, as I've said repeatedly, would be the end of us all, basically. Even if it doesn't escalate to nuclear war, it would, at the very least, lead to a breakdown in international trade. The global economy would collapse, and the United States would be isolated with reduced food production capacity and almost zero manufacturing capacity, because even the manufacturing of consumer goods and intermediate goods, capital goods, I should say, that we have here, goods that are used in the production of consumer goods. That production here in the United States still heavily reliant on international trade inputs, from international sources. A war between the United States and Russia, as a result of the declaration of a no-fly zone, even if it did not escalate to nuclear war, which, again, at this point, this is me trying to be as positive as possible about the situation. I've said, going back on this channel, it was a given that if the U.S. and Russia ever went to war with another, that it would become a nuclear war. Now that there's actually a chance of these two countries going to war, I'm trying to, think, okay, maybe there's a chance that won't happen. It will still be a disaster. So, with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.